I'm about to share something that still feels surreal. 6 months ago, I was living quietly, dreaming of a simple wedding. Now I'm married and reeling from a fiasco that nearly ruined my ceremony. Let me back up. My name is Camilla, and for as long as I can remember, my parents have favored my older sister Vivian. She was their miracle child. 2 years later, I arrived unplanned. If Vivian wanted the spotlight, she got it. When I was 12, I planned a small birthday party. Vivian demanded a shopping trip, so my parents canceled my celebration. In high school, I got good grades. Vivian brought home average marks. My parents focused on her needs, leaving me to fend for myself. By the time college applications rolled around, they told me they'd help Vivian first. If I was so smart, I could handle things alone. I did just that, earning a scholarship and rarely returning home. Though I seldom visited, each trip reminded me nothing had changed. Vivian still ruled the roost, and my parents made every excuse to justify her demands. She hopped between jobs, yet they funded her shopping sprees, believing she'd eventually find her passion. Whenever I dared mention my own needs, they dismissed me with a wave. Despite it all, I tried not to resent them. I told myself families weren't perfect, and maybe I'd moved on. But a bitter part of me couldn't forget how they treated me as an afterthought. Leon noticed my quiet anger. He'd hold my hand, promise he'd stand up for me if they crossed a line, and urge me to keep faith in us. Eventually, he proposed. I knew wedding planning would be complicated, but I never imagined what would unfold. The day we announced our engagement, my mother asked if I realized Vivian was single and might feel offended. That set the tone. Soon after, Leon insisted on meeting my parents in Arlinsville. The moment he walked into their house, my mother and father wasted no time reminding him how fragile Vivian was. When he came back that evening, he looked stunned. I braced myself for the worst. Instead, Leon grinned. "You won't believe this," he said. "Your parents and sister want Vivian to walk down the aisle at our wedding, in a wedding dress, before you." I thought he was joking. He played a recording of my sister whining it wasn't fair I got to marry first. My parents suggested a shared moment so she wouldn't feel upstaged. I felt horrified. Leon, however, was calm. "Let's give them enough rope," he whispered. "We'll play along." Over the next weeks, my parents planned with Leon, avoiding me. They assumed I'd never agree, so they kept me in the dark. Leon acted sympathetic to their scheme. He claimed I had poor judgment, so nothing should be put in writing. They agreed, happy he was on their side. Meanwhile, we upgraded our wedding. My parents offered to pay, provided Vivian got her catwalk. At tastings, I'd pick cheap options, Leon would show her pricier ones, and she'd complain to my parents. They paid for upgrades, convinced I'd be too embarrassed to resist on the day. Part of me was hurt they'd stoop so low, but another part saw the humor. Leon's determination to subvert them brought relief. For once, maybe I wouldn't lose out. Finally, the wedding day arrived. My heart pounded backstage. Their plan. I'd be clueless while Vivian strutted in. White first, but Leon and I hired security, instructing them not to admit anyone in a wedding dress except me. Minutes before the ceremony, my father stepped into the aisle expecting me. Instead, I emerged with Leon's father. My dad froze, glancing back for Vivian, presumably blocked at the door. Guests looked puzzled. He rushed off, muttering about an emergency. People whispered. I continued, arm linked with Leon's father. My cheeks burned, but I pressed on. Leon met me at the altar, whispered to breathe, and I managed a shaky smile. We exchanged vows amid quiet chaos. Later, I learned Vivian had arrived in a bridal gown, demanding entry. Security refused. My parents threatened a scene but lacked any proof of a deal. Relatives were furious upon hearing my sister's ploy. My mother wept. My father sputtered about betrayal. Cameras caught them fleeing. Our ceremony carried on. We danced and celebrated, ignoring the turmoil. Guests whispered that they'd never seen anything like it. And for the first time, I felt free. This fiasco was absurd, but it also gave me a taste of triumph, and that was only the beginning. After years of being overshadowed, I felt a rush of vindication. I vowed to fiercely guard my peace. In the aftermath of the ceremony, I woke up feeling both triumphant and hollow. Yes, I had defied my parents' toxic favoritism, but a part of me mourned that it had come to this. Leon assured me we hadn't done anything wrong, that my parents and Vivian had engineered the scheme, but the rush of victory gave way to a weary sadness. We delayed our honeymoon to tie up loose ends. Word of the wedding fiasco spread fast. Curious relatives and friends began flooding my phone with messages, from stunned congratulations to outright disbelief. Some apologized for not stepping in. Others asked if I was sure I hadn't misunderstood my sister's intentions. It was exhausting, but I reminded myself that Leon and I were officially married, which was what truly mattered. What troubled me most was trying to grasp whether my parents honestly believed their plan could work. Did they think I'd stand aside while Vivian hijacked my ceremony? Or was it a twisted way to reassert that I'd never measure up to my sister? The more I pondered it, the more I realized I might never get a satisfying answer. Leon's brother, Marcus, heard the tale over a video call. He was appalled but also half amused at the sheer audacity of it. He joked about viral videos, but we agreed that broadcasting our family drama wasn't an option. My extended family was split. Some jumped to my defense while others wanted to hear both sides. That part stung, yet I wasn't surprised. My parents had always painted Vivian as deserving endless pity. That evening, my parents finally called. My mother's voice dripped with accusation. She demanded to know if I was proud of humiliating them. I reminded her they had tried to sabotage my wedding. She dismissed it as a misunderstanding, claiming Leon had invited Vivian to do a symbolic walk. I refused to listen to more excuses and hung up. Moments later, my sister texted me a barrage of insults. I blocked her. My father never reached out, which told me enough. Leon took my phone and suggested we escape the chaos. We had time off. So why not salvage some peace? We packed for a short trip to a lakeside cabin, hoping distance would help us breathe again. Yet, as the train carried us away from Arlinsville, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. My family hated losing, and this was the biggest loss they'd ever endured. Deep down, I suspected they weren't done. After all these years, I knew how they operated. They would scheme until they found a way to twist events back in their favor. While Leon dozed beside me, I stared out the window, recalling every bitter moment of being overshadowed by Vivian. Had I finally broken free, or was I stepping into a new phase of conflict? Part of me wanted to forget them entirely, but a weary voice inside warned that my parents and sister would claw for control if they saw a chance. By the time we reached the cabin, I decided to stop dwelling on their motives. I had Leon, who stood by me unflinchingly. We were married. I should embrace this milestone. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging worry that something else was brewing. If there was one certainty, it was that Vivian would never accept this defeat quietly. Leon's optimism helped me push aside my fears for a while. We sipped coffee on the cabin's porch, laughing about silly memories from our college days, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt normal. Then my phone chimed again. Another text from a distant cousin demanding I explain why I'd banned my own sister from my wedding. My shoulders sagged. Leon reached for my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Let's turn off our phones," he suggested. "We deserve a few days of peace." I hesitated, knowing my family would likely spin the story further, but I agreed. If they wanted to twist the knife, they'd do it whether I responded or not. I powered down my phone, slid it into my suitcase, and followed Leon back inside. We lit a small fire in the hearth, trying to let the crackling flames burn away our worries. For the first time in years, I felt like I was putting my own happiness before family obligations. Part of me believed it was the healthiest choice I'd ever made. Another part feared the consequences, but I couldn't keep living in fear of my parents' disapproval or my sister's tantrums. I'd finally stood up for myself, and though I was bracing for their next move, I also felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward living a life unburdened by their shadows. I vowed to fiercely guard my peace. We spent 3 peaceful days at the lakeside cabin, shutting out the world's noise. The stress knots in my shoulders loosened, and I found myself laughing at Leon's corny jokes again. Each morning, we'd wake up to the sound of lapping water and birdsong, reminders that life could be simple and sweet when toxic people weren't hovering nearby. Yet on the drive back to our apartment, reality loomed. With my phone powered up again, I braced for whatever message might pop up first. Sure enough, there were missed calls from my mother and multiple voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. Scrolling through them, I saw 3 from an aunt I barely spoke to, 2 from an old friend of my parents, and 1 from an unknown number with a local prefix. My heart rate spiked, but Leon squeezed my hand reassuringly. "We'll deal with it together," he said. First, we listened to the voicemails. From my aunt, she rambled about wanting to know my side of the story before things got out of hand. Then she mentioned that my parents had told her I was unstable and complicated, possibly needing therapy. My stomach turned. It was classic. Deflection. Paint me as the irrational one so their actions seemed justified. Next, I played the messages from the family friend. She sounded cautious, almost apologetic, saying she'd heard a rumor that I barred Vivian from the wedding because I was jealous of her. I nearly threw my phone in frustration. Leon urged me to ignore them, but I couldn't. Part of me refused to let my parents rewrite the narrative. I texted that aunt, explaining, Vivian tried to walk down the aisle in a wedding dress before me. We had no choice but to stop her. Her reply arrived minutes later. That's not what your parents are saying. By then, it was clear my parents were telling everyone that this was all a big misunderstanding, orchestrated by Leon and me to humiliate Vivian. They conveniently omitted how they had planned the entire charade. What truly set me off, however, was a message from the unknown local number. It turned out to be the manager of a nearby events venue, politely asking if I intended to book another date for Vivian's ceremony. Confused, I called back. The manager apologized for any misunderstanding, but said my mother had contacted them to discuss a combined celebration for Vivian, given that my wedding had ended in chaos. Stunned, I could only murmur a thank you before hanging up. Leon went rigid with anger when I told him. They're doubling down, he muttered. They can't admit they lost, so they're spinning new lies. He insisted we get out in front of it and set the record straight with a bigger portion of the family. Normally, I'd want to avoid the drama, but after hearing how bold my parents were, I agreed. We drafted a calm, factual group message. We understand there are questions about what happened at our wedding. Vivian arrived in a bridal gown and attempted to walk down the aisle before me. Security, hired for general safety, did not allow anyone wearing a wedding dress inside except the bride. Our parents were aware of this, but seemed to have second thoughts once the ceremony began. We regret any confusion, but we are happy to share more details if needed. Then we sent it to uncles, aunts, cousins, everyone in our extended family we could reach. Predictably, chaos ensued. Some relatives thanked us for clarifying, others demanded to hear my parents' version. A few chose to believe we were the villains no matter what, convinced that nobody would do something so brazen unless they were set up. My phone buzzed nonstop until Leon gently took it from me again. Let's not drown in this, he said. They'll believe what they want. But my parents didn't let up. My mother soon posted on social media, claiming Leon and I had locked Vivian out of spite. She wrote a long rant about how family is supposed to be inclusive and forgiving, even when there are misunderstandings. My father, who rarely posted anything, suddenly chimed in with supportive comments about not airing private drama. It was all so hypocritical that I nearly laughed. The real blow came when I discovered that my parents had dug up a few old photos of me in less flattering circumstances, like a college Halloween party where I dressed in a ridiculous costume, and shared them with snide captions implying I was unstable. Although they didn't outright say it, they heavily implied these images were proof of my erratic behavior. Furious, I debated responding, but Leon advised me to hold back. That's exactly what they want, he said. One evening I opened my inbox to find a message from a reporter at some clickbait-style website. She asked if I'd be willing to share my shocking wedding story so they could run an exclusive piece. My jaw dropped. Apparently, word had spread beyond family circles and the story was morphing into some sensational gossip. I stared at the message, feeling both appalled and exhausted. Was this really happening? Yet amid all this turmoil, a fierce conviction grew inside me. I would not be the scapegoat again. I had spent my entire life letting my parents define me, overshadow me, and chip away at my confidence. Now, they were launching a full-on campaign to cast me as the villain. Fine, let them throw everything they had. I wasn't backing down. Leon and I agreed to stand firm in the truth. We didn't orchestrate anything. My parents and Vivian had gone too far, and we simply refused to roll over. If this was the next chapter of conflict, so be it. I was done playing the role of the quiet doormat. The day after I saw that reporter's inquiry, Leon and I sat across from each other at our tiny kitchen table, sipping coffee in tense silence. Neither of us had slept much. We were both thinking the same thing. Where did we draw the line? Part of me wanted to shout the truth from every rooftop to blast my parents' manipulative behavior in public. Another part feared that stirring the pot further would just feed the flames. Leon tapped his fingers on the table. I've been thinking, he said. Maybe we should talk to an attorney. My eyebrows shot up. Over a family feud? He shrugged. They're slandering you online, twisting the narrative and encouraging others to do the same. Even if we don't file a lawsuit, knowing our rights might help us push back. His words made a strange sense. This was no longer a private spat. They were publicly smearing us, and who knew what lengths they'd go to next. The idea of legal counsel felt drastic, but these were drastic circumstances. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus, Leon's brother. He'd been following the unfolding drama from afar and wanted to check in. Over speakerphone, his exasperated voice filled our kitchen. I just saw your parents' newest post, he groaned. They're claiming you staged fake security to ban your sister for no good reason. They even posted some chat screenshots, though it's mostly them texting themselves. A knot formed in my stomach. They're forging messages now? Marcus hesitated. I can't say for sure, but it looks suspicious. The timestamps are all over the place. They're basically painting you two as con artists. Leon thanked his brother and hung up, eyes dark with anger. That's it, we're shutting this down. We made an appointment with a local lawyer who specialized in defamation and family disputes. Walking into that law office felt surreal. I'd never imagined needing legal advice against my own parents. The lawyer, Ms. Carter, listened intently as we laid out the story, from Vivian's attempt to hijack our ceremony to the online smear campaign. She took notes methodically, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When we finished, she sighed. I've handled cases like this, although they're not common. Here's the thing. Defamation requires showing actual harm. If they're lying about you in a way that damages your reputation or livelihood, you have grounds to pursue legal remedies. But lawsuits are stressful and expensive. Are you sure you want to go that route? Leon and I exchanged a look. We weren't eager to drag this into court, but it felt good to know we had options. Ms. Carter suggested sending a formal cease and desist letter first. It might make them think twice before posting more fabrications, she said. We agreed. That afternoon, she drafted a letter addressed to my parents, instructing them to remove false statements from social media and stop circulating defamatory allegations. She also mentioned that we had evidence, including the recorded conversation, where they suggested Vivian walk down the aisle in a bridal gown. As we read the final draft, a wave of relief washed over me. For the first time since my wedding, I felt like there was a clear path to defend myself. A few days later, the letter was sent via certified mail and email. We waited anxiously for a response. My parents blocked me on every platform, but their pages went suspiciously quiet. Vivian, however, posted a flurry of vague rants about traitors in the family and people who can't handle the truth. She never mentioned me by name, but it was obvious who she meant. We captured screenshots just in case. Meanwhile, the reporter who'd contacted me grew more persistent, even messaging Leon to claim she had exclusive info from my sister's side. Leon ignored her at first, but she wouldn't stop. Finally, he wrote back, cautioning her that any piece she published containing false claims could lead to legal action. She never replied again. For a brief moment, I thought the storm might be passing. With no new posts from my parents and the threat of legal measures hovering, I began to let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then, late one night, I got a text from an unknown number. It read, "They're coming to see you, better be ready." My heart hammered. Who sent this, and what did it mean? Leon was away on a short business trip, so I paced our living room alone, trying to guess the sender's identity. Could it be one of my cousins warning me? Or was it someone on my parents' side, hinting at a confrontation? My instincts told me to prepare for the worst. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and tried to calm my racing mind. The next morning I called Leon. He was alarmed, but not entirely shocked. "Your parents are unpredictable," he said. "If they think you're threatening their image, they might show up unannounced." Sure enough, that afternoon, someone knocked on our door. I peered through the peephole, heart in my throat. My mother stood there with tears in her eyes. Behind her was my father, arms crossed, looking furious. I hesitated, torn between not letting them in and not wanting a shouting match in the hallway. Finally, I opened the door a crack. "What do you want?" I asked, voice trembling. My mother sniffled dramatically. "We need to talk, face to face." They pushed past the door before I could stop them, my father muttering something about having no intention of standing outside like beggars. My living room suddenly felt too small. I eyed the clock, willing Leon to come home, but he wouldn't be back for another day, so I braced myself. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, launching into a tirade about how I'd destroyed the family's harmony. She insisted I was overreacting, and that the entire wedding fiasco was a misunderstanding. When I tried to interject, my father silenced me with a glare. He claimed Leon had manipulated me into believing they were the villains. "Do you hear yourselves?" I finally said, voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "You asked Vivian to walk down the aisle before me, in a wedding dress. How could you possibly defend that?" My father's lips thinned. "It was a tradition in our ancestors' village," he said, grasping at straws. "When the younger sibling marries first, the older one is given a symbolic role." The explanation was so flimsy that I nearly laughed. My mother added, "We never wanted to ruin your day. We just wanted to honor both our daughters." It was infuriating. They refused to acknowledge reality. They had conspired with Vivian, lied to me, and funded the entire stunt. Now, cornered by a cease and desist letter, they acted as if they were the wounded parties, forced to come plead for reconciliation. "I know you received our lawyer's letter," I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "If you keep slandering us, there will be consequences." My father bristled, but my mother's eyes flickered with something like fear. She mumbled that lawyers were unnecessary in a loving family. I stood my ground. "Then stop lying about me and Leon. Remove your posts and tell Vivian to do the same. Show me you're serious about apologizing." My father's face darkened. "Apologizing for what? Protecting your sister's feelings?" His rage bubbled over. He slammed a fist on my kitchen counter, making the utensils clatter. I jumped. Memories flooded back, of him yelling when I was a child, always over something that made Vivian upset. My mother tried to calm him, but he shrugged her off. I inched backward near my phone, in case I needed to call for help. "I'm asking you to leave," I said quietly. "This is going nowhere." My mother's tears dried instantly. She exchanged a glance with my father. Then she spoke in a lowered voice. "If you do this, if you cut us off, you'll regret it. Families should stick together, even through misunderstandings." It sounded less like a plea and more like a warning. They stormed out, leaving me trembling. I locked the door and called Leon. He told me to stay calm and not let them bully me. Still, my nerves were shot. I double-checked our security system and tried to distract myself by cleaning the apartment, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. Had I really reached the point of no return with my own parents? By the time Leon returned the next day, I was emotionally drained. He hugged me tight, and we talked for hours. He suggested we document everything, from their sudden visit to each social media post, in case we needed it later. Then he paused. "Do you think they'd try something else? Something bigger?" I considered the possibility. My parents were proud and stubborn. Vivian was vindictive. All three hated that they were being exposed as the aggressors. "They might," I admitted, "but what more can they do?" The next few days felt like living in a pressure cooker. I dreaded every knock on the door, every unknown caller. Then one afternoon I saw a strange truck idling on the street below our window. A man I didn't recognize stepped out and began snapping photos of our building. My stomach clenched. Was this some investigator my parents hired? A process server? Leon rushed downstairs, but by the time he reached the sidewalk, the truck was gone. That evening, I got a text from my Aunt Linda, the only relative who'd consistently taken my side. "Be careful," she wrote. "Your dad's been talking about how to teach you a lesson. I don't know what he means, but he's serious." My blood ran cold. Was he planning legal action or something more sinister? Leon and I debated our options. Should we go somewhere else for a while? Ask a friend if we could stay over? We refused to let fear dictate our lives, but the tension was unbearable. We changed our locks and installed a door camera, just in case. Meanwhile, the cease and desist had silenced my parents' social media, but Vivian continued posting cryptic attacks. She wrote about dark family secrets and how she could ruin people's reputations if she wanted. It felt like a ticking bomb. 1 week later, a letter arrived in our mailbox. No return address, just our names typed on the front. Leon opened it while I stood beside him, heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "We can settle this privately, or we can all go down together. Your move." I stared at the words, adrenaline surging. This was no bluff. My parents or Vivian were willing to drag us through the mud to salvage their pride. I felt cornered, the walls closing in. But strangely, a new determination flared up. Enough was enough. I wasn't that timid child anymore. I looked at Leon, whose jaw was clenched. They want a war, he said quietly. Then we'll give them one. I never imagined I'd be preparing for a showdown with my own flesh and blood, yet there I was, scanning every corner of my apartment as though expecting intruders. The anonymous note confirmed our worst suspicions. My parents and Vivian wanted to push us until we surrendered or escalated. Leon and I chose escalation, on our terms. First, we revisited Ms. Carter, our lawyer. We handed her the ominous note. She frowned. This is borderline blackmail. They're implying a threat to release damaging information, or possibly fabricate it if you don't comply with their demands. She recommended we file a police report for documentation. My heart thudded at the idea of involving law enforcement, but I saw no other choice. After the report was made, we updated Aunt Linda. She was horrified yet not surprised. Your father's pride was always his Achilles heel, she said. He can't stand being publicly shamed, even if it's his own fault. And Vivian, she's grown used to your parents cleaning up her messes. That same day, I received an email from an old college acquaintance, someone I barely knew. She apologized for contacting me out of the blue but said she'd seen a disturbing message on a private social media group. It was a rant, apparently posted by Vivian under a pseudonym, accusing me of psychological manipulation and sabotaging her life. The acquaintance was worried it could harm my professional reputation if it leaked, so she gave me screenshots. My heart sank as I read the vile accusations, all untrue. Vivian had even claimed I stole money from her during high school. It was surreal. We immediately forwarded the screenshots to Ms. Carter, who added them to our growing file of evidence. She advised us to stay calm and continue documenting everything. Yet calm was the last thing I felt. Each day I woke up wondering if my job or friendships would be targeted next. Leon was furious too, but he channeled his anger into careful planning. He kept reminding me, we have the truth on our side. Meanwhile, my parents maintained an eerie silence. No calls, no confrontations at my door. They must have realized that direct contact after the cease and desist letter and our police report would worsen their position. Instead, it seemed they delegated the dirty work to Vivian, who had no problem stirring up chaos from behind a keyboard. But then came the break none of us expected. One of Vivian's old friends reached out to Leon privately. She claimed Vivian had confided a plan to leak doctored photos of me if I didn't back down. The friend had grown uneasy after seeing how extreme things had become. She gave Leon details, even a snippet of a chat log where Vivian bragged about her editing skills and how easy it would be to ruin me. My stomach churned. I recognized the friend's name. She'd been part of, Vivian's circle in high school, someone who used to tease me. Now, apparently, she had a conscience. Armed with this new information, Ms. Carter suggested we file for a restraining order against Vivian, citing harassment and credible threats. It felt drastic. Restraining orders were for stalking or physical violence, right? But Ms. Carter insisted that harassment includes attempts to destroy someone's life through false information. Leon and I talked it through for hours. Did we really want to push Vivian to that extreme? Could it escalate her anger? In the end, we decided to proceed. Enough was enough. The next days were a flurry of paperwork. We wrote detailed statements, provided screenshots, and gave the contact information of Vivian's friend who was willing to testify. When we finally submitted the documents, I felt an odd mix of dread and relief. We were taking a stand, but we were also lighting the fuse on a powder keg. Days passed. We heard nothing from Vivian or my parents. Then, one Thursday morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Carter. Judge granted a temporary restraining order. Vivian is forbidden from contacting you or posting about you. If she violates it, you can press charges. I exhaled so hard I nearly cried. Leon hugged me, relief evident in his eyes. In the subsequent weeks, everything changed. My parents erupted, calling me cruel for attacking my own sister with legal threats. They painted Vivian as the victim, forced into silence by her vindictive sibling. Some relatives took their side, others stayed neutral, and a few supported me quietly. But Vivian went silent. She either decided not to break the order or had realized the severity of the consequences. My parents tried to circumvent the situation by claiming they spoke on Vivian's behalf, refusing to remove their incendiary posts. Ms. Carter sent them a formal warning that they were aiding in harassment if they continued. That seemed to rattle them enough to back off. Their accounts grew quiet and phone calls ceased. It wasn't a blissful victory. How could I feel triumphant about tearing my family apart? But it was a victory of sorts. I preserved my name, my marriage, and my sanity. One final shock arrived in the mail a month later, a handwritten letter from my mother. She said Vivian was checking into therapy for emotional distress, and implied it was all my fault. She also wrote that my father would never forgive me for bringing lawyers into a family matter. I read the letter twice, searching for any hint of regret or apology. There was none. I put it aside, no longer surprised. They would never see their wrongdoing. They'd cling to their version of events forever. Maybe in their minds I was still the child who should have just obeyed, but I wasn't that child anymore. I was free to build a life without their warped priorities overshadowing me. That evening, Leon and I stood by our window watching the sunset. "We made it," he murmured. I felt tears well up. The cost was steep, family bonds shattered, old memories tainted, yet a calmness settled in my chest. For once I stood up for myself and refused to be overshadowed. Yes, it was painful, but it was my life, finally on my own terms. As the sky turned golden, I realized I wasn't mourning what I'd lost. I was embracing what lay ahead. A future, shaped by my choices, not my family's manipulations. And that, more than anything else, felt like the happy ending I deserved. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.